In this video, we're going to talk about how to add a temporary power-up to our scene. Specifically, we have a little character that can move around, and we want to get the power-up, want to move really quick, and then after a certain amount of seconds, we want to move our normal speed again. So just a really simple speed boost, and we will talk about how to do that, as well as do some burst particles and some trail effects and some other visuals to communicate to the player that the power-up was collected and that it's active or no longer active. We'll talk about coroutines, we'll talk about a few other things to make this look really nice, but in the end, you should be able to create simple little power-ups for your scene. First, let me show you our starting scene. So right now we have a little player character. This is going to be the player ship. It has a rigid body, a collider, and a player ship script. So on this script right here, let me open it up. Inside it's pretty simple. We have a move speed, we have a turn speed, we have a rigid body. I'm collapsing some of this stuff because it doesn't matter. You're going to have your own character that will move however you want, and this is mine. For this project, we'll do a spaceship. We also have a camera script that just follows the player around. Pretty simple. Just if I hit play, you can see. Camera just centers the player ship. The other thing that's important is our player ship has a sub game object right here that has some art pieces to it. So if you want to build your own ship, these are just really simple primitives. The key thing here is just to not have any colliders. So this is our character controller. This is our environment. As long as you have something that moves around in the scene and your camera keeps up with it, then you should be fine. So first, let's create our speed power up. I'm just going to create the game object for that first, and we're going to do this pretty similar to the player ship. We're going to, let's say, create a sphere. Let's zero that out, make sure that the player is on the same plane right here. So we'll just position it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate out the art from the collider here. So for example, I'm going to create another, let's create an empty. We'll call this art. Create another game object, sphere like that. And this is going to be the actual sphere for the object. So I don't want any colliders on my art. So I'm just going to remove that, right click, remove. So this is our art. And I want to make sure that I remove my art from my collider up at the top here. So this is our art, no collider. This is our actual speed power up, which let's relabel that speed power up. And now we're going to remove the art. So right click, remove. All right, we're good. Let's make this look a little nicer. Let's give it a material. So I already have one made here, but if you wanted to, just create a new material, change the albedo to green and change the emission. Check that emission and then make it some lighter green like that. If we apply that to the sphere right here, then what this allows us to do is, with our art separate, we can disable the art, but still keep our collider, which is what we eventually want to do. So this is our game object. The next thing we need is our script to give our speed power up some behavior. I'm going to come down to my scripts folder, right click, create, C#, call this speed power up. Let's apply this to the speed power up. Don't forget this, it's easy to forget. There's actually one extra thing we need to do. On our speed power up, we don't want the player to actually collide with the power up and lose velocity. So we want this to be a trigger. We want our player to go right through it at its normal speed, and then something will happen. Typically you do that with a trigger. So I'm going to check this is trigger checkbox right here. Make sure you do that, otherwise bad things will happen. Let's go back into our script. So right now we're going to start with nothing. And let's think of a few things we might need. So I'm going to do a serialized field, speed crease amount. That's going to be a float, speed increase amount. Well, let's give that a default to 20. Let's do another one. Because this is a power up, we only want this to have the effect for a certain amount of time. Let's call this power up duration. Let's default that pretty low just for testing. We'll say 3 seconds. We're probably going to need more stuff up here, but for now, let's just start coding and see what happens. Because I want to detect when the player enters this trigger, remember we have our collider right here with isTrigger on it. So this is going to be a trigger, meaning that we have to use onTriggerEnter. So what happens here is when the other player collides with the trigger on this script, right? Our speed Powerup script is on this Powerup. We're going to get the other collider, meaning the player's collider, when these two things collide, the other collider, so player's collider, and we have access to it, which means we can do some things. For example, we're going to make a temporary variable called playership. The reason why we want to test for a playership is really kind of arbitrary. We just want to test for some other script on the other object. So in this case, our speed Powerup wants to know if an object with a certain script, in this case, playership, enters our trigger. Now I chose playership because we're going to want to manipulate the move speed or other things on the player. If we had a different script like player movement and we wanted to access that, then we could do the same thing. We would just call this player movement instead of playership. But in this case, I want to do a search and find this specific component or script, if you want to think about it that way, on the other object. So collider enters, remember the other collider, do a search for playership. So that's what we're going to do. Playership is equal to other, this is our other collider that we get, dot GameObject. So in this case, we're moving up one level to the overall GameObject. So we're collider.GameObject, the whole playership. And then we're going to do a search on this entire GameObject for a certain kind of component. In this case, we're going to search for the playership component. To do that, we say dot, so GameObject dot get component, bracket, and then the class name, which is going to be our, well, the name of the component, playership, parentheses. I'm going to put this on one line like that. So we created an empty container of type playership. We are getting access to the other collider. We are looking at that game object, right? The whole game object. Let me drag this over like that. Doing a search and looking for this kind of component. We search this game object, we find playership, and so then we store that here. Now to make sure that we actually found something and that this is not just empty because it's empty by default, we can say if playership is not equal null. If it does equal null, then that means it's empty. If it does not equal null, that means that we found something and there's something inside of the container. So we'll open up our if statement, and since we know that we found the ship, at this point we can do something, right? Powerup, sequence, whatever. So at this point we need to start talking about coroutines. And a coroutine is essentially a method that we can run. So we, let's call this, we're going to change this name eventually, but let's say you had something called Powerup Sequence. Now, right now, this is a normal method, but if this were a coroutine, what this would allow us to do is activate, wait for some amount of time, and then deactivate. So typically, you're going to see coroutines used when you need to do something over time. Specifically, what a coroutine allows us to do is we can run some code, we can hit a certain point, and then next time we do another loop, it will continue from that point rather than at the beginning. So we can essentially use that to wait over time or to continue where we left off to do something incrementally, like a little bit each game loop, and it does something over time. Whereas in a normal method, you would actually, go top to bottom and you couldn't really wait anywhere because there are other things that need to run. So that's the idea, really. And in order to create a coroutine, instead of returning void, we actually are going to return an I enumerator. Let's say public I enumerator. There we go. And it's going to give me an error because I'm not returning anything yet, and we need to return something in order for this to be true. So in order to start our coroutine, which we'll put some code in there, we need to say start coroutine, and then we give it a name. So I'm just going to copy paste this right there. All right, so we have this. And if I want to get rid of this error, the code for wait for some amount of time is yield return new wait for seconds. That, and then we can tell it how long we want to wait. We want to wait for the Powerup duration. So I'm going to copy that. However long the designer specifies. I'm actually going to get rid of this over here. There we go. Okay, so we will activate, we'll wait for the Powerup duration, and then we will deactivate. The other thing we may want is access to the player ship. Since we already searched and we already found it, we might as well just pass that into the Powerup sequence. So we can do things to it. So for example, increase the speed or decrease the speed or whatever. So let's actually use a parameter here. So our Powerup sequence needs access to player ship. So we'll take that in as a parameter. And now whenever we run this method, we actually need to send our local variable right here. Remember, we did our local variable, searched it, found it, verified it, pass it in. So now that we have access to it, then we can do other things. So change the speed or other things if we want. So here's the other thing that we need to think about. Typically, whenever you want to destroy an object, so let's say I collect a coin, that coin no longer exists. In this case, we want to do something. We want this object to still exist so it can run its Powerup duration, but then we want to do something after, which means that we can't just say destroy. So the question is, whenever our player ship collides with this Powerup, what do? How do we destroy it but have it stay active? Now, the way that I'm going to recommend doing it this way is instead of actually disabling it like that, because that would stop the scripts from running, we're actually going to disable the collider. So the functionality will be disabled. We're not going to get on trigger events anymore. And we're going to disable the art like that. So this script is still running because the game object is still active, but the collider is not accepting collision, so we can't trigger it multiple times. And the art is disabled, so we can't see it. So functionally, it's like a soft disable instead of, actually disabling or destroying the object. And that's going to give us the functionality we want. So I'm going to re-enable our art. And this is why we broke our art into a separate thing so that we could, disable everything that is just visual and our collider. So I'm going to turn that back on. So in order to do that, what I want to do is I want to specify what is the art game object that I want to disable. So let's make another field up here. We'll call this type of game object. It can be very generic. Art to disable. We'll just say equals null, it doesn't matter, because we're going to fill that in. And then additionally, we need access to the collider to disable as well. Now, we could do another field just like this, but just to show you that if it's on the same game object, we can actually just search and find it. So inside of awake, we're going to look for collider like that. Let's make a private variable. And this is going to be our sphere collider. So remember, we want to disable our sphere trigger and our art. So let's do the collider first. First, we're going to do a search. This is our script. We're going to search this game object, and we're going to try and find a collider. I should find this. So we'll say collider is equal to get component collider. It's to be the same type, this right here. So we'll fill that. If we want to guarantee that we can find one, we can at the very top say require component type of collider. This just means that if we want to apply this script to something, then this will enforce that it has a collider on it. We're going to fill that. And second thing we're going to do is we're going to fill the art to disable. So we'll save this, come back in, let that compile. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify that this game object right here, I'm going to drag this in like that. So it will disable this object, including every other child object on there. So if those are all your visuals, you're disabling all the art. So if you had particles or whatever, and you had that included, it would also disable that. So disable the art, search for the collider. I'm really just showing you two different ways to do it because you could do a search child objects or something if you wanted, but this is cleaner. Go back in here. Now let's start our sequence. We're going to activate our particles, but also we need to soft disable. And to do that, it's just collider.enabled equals false. So we're turning off the collider component, basically clicking that checkbox right there. And art to disable. This one is a game object. So, all right, it's going to be like this checkbox, not that checkbox. So the code's just a little bit different. It's art to disable dot set active false. Slightly different. So once we do this, if I come in here and I hit play, I should at least be able to collect the object. If I did it right, we'll see. Hit play, come in here. Okay, it turns off, but you can see it's still there in the scene, right? Our collider is disabled and our art is disabled, so that's good. Alrighty, so now that we did that, we need to actually do something to the player. In this case, we want to increase the speed, so our move speed here. Now currently it's private, meaning that we can't really change the speed directly inside of another script. So there's multiple ways to handle this. In a less beginner tutorial, I would say we could use properties and we could expose this and say, you know, public set, and we'd do it that way. We're not going to worry about that. I'm going to show you just, we're going to make a public method. We'll call this set move speed. And we're going to take in a new speed adjustment. And this is a little weird, but we're actually adjusting the speed by an amount. So maybe we could call this something different. That's fine. And what we want to do is we want to take the current speed, so our move speed right at the top up here, and we want to say plus equals, which means add this adjustment to the current amount, new speed adjustment. And the cool thing about this is if this was negative speed adjustment, it would actually end up subtracting it. So say plus equals -5, it would just subtract it. But this way we can actually adjust the speed from a separate script, which is what we want to do. The other advantage of doing this through a method is that we can actually do additional things. So for example, speed flash or something, we could do some visuals when the speed changes or whatever, play some sound effects. So let's save this. Let's go back to our speed power up. Now we're not actually doing the power up here, right? So let's actually break this out into a separate method too. We'll say activate power up. And then after, we're going to say deactivate power up. And that way we can go to these comments because they're now self-explanatory. Let's make this method down here now. So private void, activate power up. And just to show you a little shortcut, you can actually right click, quick actions and refactor, generate method, and it'll just make it right there. Just make sure you get rid of this right here. Okay. We can also get rid of this because it's also self-explanatory now. And I'm going to reshuffle these. Okay. So when we want to activate the power up, we want to change the player speed, right? So player ship, and we actually don't have access to the player ship here, right? So we're going to pass this down one more time. Our activate power up is going to take in the player ship. I'm going to copy paste that. And we're just going to pass this right down, right? We got it originally up here, pass it in, get here, pass it in, player ship. Okay. So now this method has access to it. Now let's say player ship dot set move speed, and we want to give it a new speed adjustment. So we come up here to speed increase amount. There we go. Pass it in. Now here's the interesting thing. In order to undo this when we deactivate, we need to negative, right? So if our increase amount was 10, when we deactivate it, we want it to be -10. So we come back down the same amount that we went up. All right. And then lastly, once we're done with all this, we're going to destroy this game object. So now it will actually destroy it. Rather, right now it's just fake disabled. And then once we finish running this, we'll actually destroy it. You know, you could, if you wanted, re-enable. You'd have to reset all this stuff too, right? But if your game, you want it to pop up again once they can collect it, you know, that's fine too, if desired. There we go. Let's save and come back into the scene. And what I should see, I think it should be functional. So let's come over here, click the player so that we can see our move speed while we're playing. Hit play. And then when we touch the power up, If we did it right, it will increase. Okay, it increased. And then it decreases after the amount of time. Okay, so we have it. It just doesn't look very fancy, but it is functional. This is our coroutine. We had to start our coroutine this way, give it the player ship, which we got from the other collider. Come down here, we do our sequence, we fake turn it off, but it's still actually running. We activate the power up, change the speed, wait, deactivate the power up, and then destroy the game object. So this is it working. After this, I want to make it more visible and to make it look a little bit better because it's functional, it just doesn't look that great yet. First, we're going to make a little booster trail to let us know that our power up is active because we want to give feedback to the player that currently your speed is increased, so they know, and then we want to, let's say, disable the trail whenever their speed is no longer increased. So just a little thing, like a little booster coming out of the player when they're moving around. We can do it several ways, but in this case, we're going to do it with a trail renderer, and I'm going to show you how to set that up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a child object. First, let's say create empty on the player ship, and I'm going to call this, let's call this a booster trail, like that. And the advantage of doing this as a child object is now I can actually position it where the booster is instead of, some weird place inside the ship. We actually want that to look like it's coming out of the booster right there. And I'm going to add component and say trail renderer. Now you're going to get a lot of things here. This thing right here, the width, is going to be looking at the game object. Now, by default, it's 1 because it's 1, 1, 1. I actually want that to be a little smaller, and I can show you why. Like, you can see if I move this around, that's way too big. We don't really want it purple necessarily. So I'm going to just drag this down like that. I think maybe that's right. It's pretty close. So let's say maybe somewhere between 0.5 and 0.4, something like that. So next, let's reduce the time because it's just lasting for too long. It's like 5 seconds or something. I'm going to put this down to, let's start at 1 and see what happens. And now when I move this around, so let's actually change this amount of time to something even lower, like 0.1. There we go. That's about right. So you can imagine if the ship was moving about this fast, just dragging it around in the scene. That's about what we want. We could adjust this later. Now the thing is, let's say instead of this being a line, maybe I want it to taper off. So I'm going to come to my little graph here and I'm going to double click. And what this allows me to do is I can create a curve on how I want that line to look. So if I drag this down, you'll see what this looks like, right? It's like a little triangle or a fireball or something. And that's pretty close. Let's say if I adjust this handle right here, like that, I think that looks a little bit better. Tweak it however you want, but I'm gonna do something like that. Now, to get rid of that little purple, typically that means our material is missing, which in this case it is. So let's just replace that with something. I'm just gonna use the default line right here. Just do the little bullseye and find it. And so now it's white, which is okay. But let's say if we want to really make the association between this green power up and our speed increase, let's just make that green. I think that would look really nice. So let's go to, let's say yellow, something like that. And on the other side of the gradient on the bottom here, I had clicked on that to do that. On this other side, I want it to fade out into, let's do more of a green like that. Okay, you can obviously do this however you want. You can even change the opacity if you want. That's the top one. Like you could actually fade it out even more like that. I don't know. We'll see how it looks, but you could do that if you wanted. Let's drag that around. Okay, that's actually not too bad. Let's save this. Now, this is a component on a game object. So what I want to be able to do is on my speed power up right here, when we come down here and we activate the power up, I want to enable the trail, and when I deactivate, I want to deactivate the trail. Now I could just do that by turning on the game object. You could do that. You could also do it by enabling the trail if you want. You could also do it by enabling the emitting or disabling the emitting if you want. That would actually be the cleanest way to do it. But just to show you that, it doesn't have to be a trail. It can be a light. It could be particle effects. It could be whatever. We're going to do it the component way. Though I would recommend that you actually do it with the emitting if you want it to look a little bit nicer. I just want to show you the like broad generic way you could control components this way. So what I'm going to do, these boosters, if you think about it, belong to the player, not the speed power up. So I don't really want the speed power up to know about the player boosters. What I could do is I could put the boosters on the player and expose those through a method just like I did right here. So maybe we call that public void set boosters. I'm going to allow other things to be able to pass in what they want it to be. Do they want it to be set boosters to on or true, or do they want to set boosters to off or false? So we'll say active state, again, passing in a parameter. Now, in order to actually disable this, I need to get access to it somewhere. Right now, we made it. It doesn't really exist. The player ship doesn't even know about it. So let's come up here and do another serialized field. We'll call this private. It's a type of, remember, trail renderer. So this is what we actually need. It's a type of trail renderer. If you're doing a light or whatever, it would be a type of light. Whatever the component class is, we'll say trail renderer. We'll just call this trail. If we save that and we come back in, we have to make sure that we actually fill this reference if we want it to work. So I'm going to take my child trail, drag it in just like that. Okay, so now our player ship does actually know about the trail renderer. So now when we come down here to boosters, we can say trail dot enabled equals active state, right? They can turn it on or off. So doing it this way, now again, you could use properties and you could expose it that way, but we're not going to get into that for now. We're going to focus on the mechanic. When we activate the power up, what we can do is we can say player ship dot set boosters, pass it in and say turn them on, true. And for deactivate, we'll say player ship set boosters false. All right, we need to do one more thing just to make sure that they're not on at the very start. We need to actually just turn them off right at the beginning. We'll say maybe the designer forgets to turn them off, whatever. Pretty easy. We'll just say on awake, turn them off. Or you could even say set boosters off. In this case, it doesn't really matter. All right, set move speed, set boosters. Okay, let's save it, come back in here, and let's test it out. Hit play. Okay, so we don't have it when we don't touch it, so let's touch it and see what happens. Okay, we get our booster, looks nice, moving fast, and then it turns off. And you can see like what I'm saying, when you disable or enable like that, it's just instantly turns off. If you do it by emitting, like emitting equals true or false, that will just let it fade out naturally. So just whatever you want to do is fine. Okay, so the last thing I want to do to make this look really nice is I want a particle burst. Now, I actually have another video to show you how to make the particle burst, so I'm not going to go through that again. Let me just show you right here. It's called Triggering Impact Particle in Unity, so you can go there and you can find it. It's a little bit longer, and I'll show you how to make this burst effect. But I'm going to show you one new addition to that. You can make your own too. Essentially, all I need is I just need a one shot that when I hit play, like this, just particle shoot out. Something simple is fine, right? As long as particle shoot out, it's using an emission and a little burst, and you can hit the play button. You can tweak with that. You can go through the video, whatever. But what I wanted to show you is if we want to have this burst happen, one way we could do it is we could actually spawn it at the time we need it. It'll play, and then it will destroy itself when it's done. So once you get this working, if you want it to play when it's created, you just come down to play on awake and check that. So make sure that that's checked. That means that whenever it's created, spawned, whatever, it will play. And then the second thing is right here under stop action. If you change this to destroy, whenever it's done, it will automatically destroy itself, which is actually really cool. We don't have to do that through code anymore. I mean, you can, but you don't need to. So once you have your particle created, again, just set it however you want, but make sure you have play on awake and stop action destroy. Let's go back, make sure that that particle is a prefab, right? Because we want to spawn it into the scene. We don't want to make it in the scene because it hasn't existed yet. Make that into a prefab, and let's actually spawn that when we need it. So let's go to the speed power up. Now remember, you always have to be thinking about what object owns what data or what information. In this case, we have our speed power up, collect particle. You might be thinking, should that belong to the player or should that belong to the speed? I would say that it should belong to the speed power up because you could have, for example, a health power up, and you might want that to be a different effect. You don't want to assign all these random effects to the player. It wouldn't scale properly. In this case, I want this specific power up's collect particle to be a certain thing. And that's my justification for why this particle burst should belong to the speed power up. So if we go to our speed power up, we're going to come back to the top, have our to disable. Let's make one more serialized field. Private particle system, whatever the type is, and we'll just call this collect particle. And I'm actually going to say prefab, just to really specify to the designer is looking for a prefab that we're going to spawn in the scene, not something else. So I'm going to say prefab, and then we need to figure out where we want to spawn it. So let's go to probably whenever we activate. I think that's fine. And we're going to say if collect particle prefab is not equal null, because technically they could just not fill this in at the top. Nothing would happen. Let's check and make sure that that's not empty. And if it's not, then let's spawn it. And in this case, it's actually pretty simple. We can just say instantiate collect particle prefab and put it at the location of this power up whenever it's collected. So transform.position. And for rotation, doesn't really matter. We can just say transform.rotation, it's fine. I'm going to break this onto a new line and semicolon. And I think this will probably do it. This code right here spawns collect particle. Self-explanatory, but I just want to give you a little bit of notes. All right, let's save that. Last thing we need to do is we need to actually fill in the prefab. Don't forget. So collect particle prefab like that. And let's see what happens. All right, there you go. We have our speed effect. We can make that nicer. We could actually have a particle effect when it's disabled, potentially. We could do a lot of things if we want, but this is the basics. You also probably want some sound effects and other things, but I think this is the minimum we need to communicate a power-up to a player. And you could have all different kinds of power-ups. In this case, we're changing the speed. You could change the scale. You could change max health. You could change lots of different things, but it's something that's happening over time, and we want to do some visuals with it, count down, deactivate, and all this. And the nice thing about all this is that it's fairly independent. So like the player ship doesn't know anything about the speed power up. We have exposed a few things that power-ups can use, like it can set the movement speed or whatever, but we would need to do that anyways. So yeah, it's pretty clean. There's ways that we can make this more modular. Like you could use inheritance to make a generic power-up and then, handle all of this one time. And then if you make a second power-up, you could, just do the activate and deactivate. We're not going to really worry about that now. Since this is a beginner tutorial, we just really want to make things work, and then we can think about how to make it more efficient later. So I hope this is helpful to you, and I hope you get to create a few cool little power-ups for your game.